World War II is often remembered for the bravery and sacrifices of soldiers from Europe and America. However, the contributions of African soldiers, drawn from colonies across the continent, remain largely unsung. These men fought bravely in some of the war's most critical campaigns, yet their sacrifices went unrecognized, their stories untold, and their lives often neglected. This video is dedicated to these forgotten heroes, particularly those from Kenya, Ethiopia, Ghana, Nigeria, and other African nations. We will explore their experiences during the war, the injustices they faced, and how many were left without the honor or compensation they deserved. Before we proceed, please take a few seconds and click the subscribe button to join this community. During World War II, the British Empire and other colonial powers recruited thousands of African soldiers to fight in battles across Europe, Asia, and Africa. These soldiers were drawn from various British colonies, including Kenya, Uganda, Nigeria, and the Gold Coast, now Ghana. One of the most notable contributions came from the King's African Rifles, KR, a regiment made up predominantly of East African soldiers from Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania. The KAR played a crucial role in the East African Campaign, particularly in the Battle of Madagascar in 1942 and the Burma Campaign. In Madagascar, British and Commonwealth forces, including the KR, fought to prevent the island from falling into the hands of the Japanese. The East African soldiers fought bravely in the harsh conditions of the jungle, facing not only enemy forces but also diseases like malaria and dengue fever. In the Burma Campaign, African soldiers were part of the 11th East African Division, which was instrumental in defeating Japanese forces in the dense jungles of Southeast Asia. These men, often referred to as the Forgotten Army, endured some of the most brutal conditions of the war, battling not only the enemy but also the unforgiving terrain and climate. Meanwhile, in Ethiopia, African soldiers played a significant role in the struggle against Italian fascism. Ethiopia, the only African nation not fully colonized at the time, was invaded by Italy in 1935, sparking the Second Italo-Ethiopian War. Emperor Haile Selassie led a fierce resistance, but his forces were eventually overwhelmed. However, with the onset of World War II, Ethiopian soldiers, alongside British and Commonwealth forces, fought valiantly to reclaim their country. The Battle of Keren in 1941 was a turning point in this campaign, with Ethiopian and Allied forces defeating the Italians, leading to the liberation of Addis Ababa and the restoration of Selassie to the throne. Despite their bravery and the crucial roles they played, African soldiers were often treated as second-class citizens. They were paid less than their white counterparts, received inferior equipment, and were subjected to harsh discipline and racist treatment by colonial officers. In many cases, these soldiers were forced to carry out menial tasks such as digging trenches or transporting supplies, rather than being allowed to fight on the front lines. One of the most tragic aspects of the African soldiers' experience in World War II was the lack of recognition and compensation they received after the war. Many African veterans returned home to find that they were not eligible for the same benefits as their European counterparts. In Kenya, for instance, former KAR soldiers were promised land and pensions, but most never received them. Instead, they were left to struggle with poverty, their contributions to the war effort largely forgotten. In Nigeria, the situation was similar. Nigerian soldiers who had served in the Royal West African Frontier Force, WWII, returned home to a country still under colonial rule with little to show for their service. Many were denied pensions or were given meagre sums that were insufficient to support their families. Some veterans, disillusioned by their treatment, took part in protests and strikes, demanding better compensation and recognition. These protests were often met with repression by the colonial authorities, further adding to the sense of betrayal felt by the African soldiers. One particularly egregious example of the mistreatment of African soldiers is the case of the 1945 Tiaroya massacre in Senegal. Senegalese soldiers who had served in the French army were being transported back to West Africa at the end of the war. Upon their return, they were detained at a military camp in Tiaroya near Dakar, where they demanded the pay and benefits they were owed. Instead of being compensated, they were met with violence. On December 1st, 1945, French forces opened fire on the unarmed soldiers, killing dozens and wounding many more. The exact number of casualties remains disputed, but the massacre highlighted the deep racial injustices faced by African soldiers. The mistreatment of African soldiers was not limited to financial compensation. Many who had fought for their colonial masters returned to find that their sacrifices were not only unappreciated, but also resented by their fellow countrymen. In some cases, African veterans were seen as traitors who had fought for the oppressors rather than for their own people. This led to a sense of alienation and despair among many veterans who struggled to reintegrate into their communities. For those who did not return home, their stories were often lost to history. Thousands of African soldiers died in the war, their bodies left in foreign lands, far from their families. In the Burma Campaign alone, it is estimated that over 30,000 African soldiers lost their lives. Many were buried in unmarked graves, their names forgotten by the very nations they had served. The lack of recognition for African soldiers in World War II has begun to be addressed in recent years, but much work remains to be done. Memorials have been erected in some countries to honour their sacrifices, and historians have started to uncover and document their stories. However, the debt owed to these unsung heroes is far from repaid. In Kenya, efforts have been made to recognise the contributions of the KR soldiers. In 2015, the Kenyan government announced plans to provide financial assistance to surviving World War II veterans. Similarly, in Nigeria, there have been calls for greater recognition of the WWII veterans, with some organisations advocating for the establishment of a national memorial. Yet, for many of the African soldiers who fought in World War II, the recognition comes too late. Most have passed away, their stories untold, and their sacrifices unacknowledged. As we remember the heroes of World War II, it is crucial that we do not forget the African soldiers who gave so much and received so little in return. The African soldiers who fought in World War II were true heroes, displaying courage, resilience and loyalty in the face of incredible adversity. They fought not just for the freedom of others, but for the dignity and rights of their own people. Yet their contributions were overlooked, their sacrifices unrecognized, and their lives devalued. As we commemorate the events of World War II, let us also honour the unsung African heroes whose stories deserve to be told. Their legacy is one of strength, perseverance, and a reminder that the fight for justice and equality is far from over. Please like, share and subscribe to this channel for more of Global Insights.